When most people think of a medieval knight, the image that forms in their mind is almost automatic. A lone warrior sits atop a powerful horse, clad in shining armor that reflects the sun. His sword is raised high, his banner flutters in the wind, and his cause is noble. He fights for honor, for his king, for faith, and for glory. This image has been repeated so many times in films, novels, paintings, and even school textbooks that it feels like unquestionable truth. The knight has become a symbol of courage, loyalty, and heroism, almost larger than life itself. But this image is not history, it is mythology. The medieval knight we celebrate today is a carefully constructed legend, shaped over centuries by poets, chroniclers, and later by modern entertainment. The reality behind the steel was far uglier, far harsher, and far more human. To understand why it truly sucked to be a medieval knight, we first have to strip away the fantasy and confront how this myth was created in the first place. In the Middle Ages, knights were not born heroes. They were not romantic figures driven by lofty ideals. They were professional fighters in a violent and unstable world. Europe between the 9th and 15th centuries was plagued by constant warfare, border conflicts, feudal disputes, invasions, rebellions, and religious wars. Violence was not an exception, it was the norm. Knights existed because society needed heavily armed men to enforce power through force. Yet even during their own time, knights were not universally admired. Many peasants feared them. Chroniclers complained about their brutality. Church leaders regularly condemned knights for their violence, greed, and lack of restraint. The idea of the noble knight did not naturally arise from their behavior. It was invented to control it. This is where the concept of chivalry enters the story. Chivalry is often described as a moral code that guided knights. Honor, bravery, loyalty, protection of the weak. But in reality, chivalry was less a reflection of how knights behaved and more a desperate attempt to civilize men who were trained to kill. The church and the nobility realized that armed warriors roaming the countryside posed a serious problem. Knights frequently abused peasants, robbed villages, and fought private wars for personal gain. Something had to be done to restrain them, so a narrative was created. Knights were told that their violence could be justified if it served a higher purpose. If they fought for God, for their Lord, or for honor, then killing became acceptable, even righteous. Songs, poems, and tales began to portray knights as defenders of justice and protectors of the innocent. Over time, these stories became more popular than reality itself. But the truth on the ground rarely matched the ideal. Most knights never rescued damsels in distress. Most never embarked on noble quests. Most never lived by the chivalric code they were praised for. They collected taxes, enforced laws through violence, and fought in brutal conflicts that had little to do with justice and everything to do with power. Glory was promised, but survival was the real goal. The myth also hides an uncomfortable truth. Knights were not equal heroes. Society was rigidly hierarchical. A knight's value depended entirely on his birth and his usefulness to those above him. Loyalty was not romantic, it was mandatory. Disobedience could mean disgrace, imprisonment, or death. A knight who questioned orders was not brave, he was dangerous. And despite the shining armor we imagine, knights were not clean, polished figures. They lived in a world without sanitation, without modern medicine, and without basic comfort. Their armor rusted, their clothes smelled, their bodies were scarred, bruised, and often permanently damaged. The heroic image ignores the physical reality of medieval life. Even the famous tournaments, often portrayed as elegant sporting events, were violent and deadly. Early tournaments were essentially mock battles with real weapons. Knights were injured or killed regularly. Participation was not always voluntary, it was expected. Winning brought fame, but losing could mean debt, injury, or humiliation. The spectacle existed to reinforce the myth of knightly honor, even as it destroyed real lives. Literature played a massive role in cementing this illusion. Tales of King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, and heroic crusaders painted an idealized version of knighthood that bore little resemblance to everyday reality. These stories were not written for peasants. They were written for nobles, by nobles. They reinforced a social order that justified power and violence at the top. Centuries later, during the Romantic period, writers and artists revived these medieval legends with renewed enthusiasm. Knights became symbols of lost purity, courage, and moral clarity in an industrializing world. The darker aspects of knighthood, brutality, exploitation, suffering, were quietly ignored. By the time modern films and games inherited this tradition, the knight had become almost entirely fictional. But history does not bend to nostalgia. The real medieval knight lived under constant pressure. He was expected to embody an ideal he could never truly reach. Honor was demanded, but survival required cruelty. Loyalty was praised, but it often meant betraying one's own conscience. Glory was promised, but pain was guaranteed. And the myth did more than just misrepresent knights, it trapped them. Once the image of the noble warrior took hold, knights were forced to live up to it publicly, even when it conflicted with reality. They had to maintain appearances, uphold reputations, and prove their worth through violence. Weakness was despised, fear was hidden, doubt was punished. The legend became a cage as much as a crown. This is why it's so important to question the image we've inherited, not to mock knights, but to understand them. They were not superheroes. They were men shaped by a brutal system, trained from childhood to fight, and expected to sacrifice their bodies and minds for causes they did not always choose. When we peel back the layers of myth, we begin to see the truth. The medieval knight was not living a dream. He was living inside a story written by others, lords, priests, poets, and kings, while paying the price in blood and bone. The shining armor was never meant to reflect reality. It was meant to distract from it. And once you see that, the legend of the knight stops being glorious, it starts being tragic. For most medieval knights, the path to knighthood began not as a choice, but as a mandate of birth and circumstance. From the moment a boy was born into a noble family, his future was already mapped out. The world of medieval Europe was rigidly hierarchical, and the expectations placed on young noble sons were immense. To be a knight was not a hobby, a dream, or an aspiration. It was a responsibility, one that carried the weight of family honor, feudal loyalty, and social expectation. Every step of a boy's life was shaped to serve this singular purpose. In the eyes of society, the boy belonged first to his lineage, then to his lord, and only finally to himself, if he was lucky enough to survive the process at all. Childhood as we understand it today, the freedom to play, to explore, to learn at one's own pace, barely existed. It was replaced by preparation, training, and discipline that would be relentless and unforgiving. By the age of 7, boys destined to become knights were sent away from the safety and comfort of home. They were placed in the service of another noble household, often far from family and familiar surroundings. These boys were called pages, and their life as a page was anything but gentle. It was a combination of education, labor, and strict oversight, designed to instill obedience and resilience. Pages were tasked with menial chores, from cleaning the castle floors to tending to horses, but these tasks were never meant to be merely functional. They were tools of conditioning designed to teach humility, endurance, and attention to detail. Mistakes were not forgiven, they were punished. A spilled bucket of water, a dent in a piece of armor, or a clumsy step in the hall could earn a page a beating or a public humiliation. The environment was one of constant scrutiny, where every action was judged not just for efficiency, but for the boy's capacity to serve and obey. Failure was not merely personal, it reflected poorly on the household that trained him, on his family's honor, and sometimes even on the political alliances that bound his life to the service of his lord. Education for a young page was a mixture of the practical and the moral, but it was never gentle. Literacy, etiquette, and basic numeracy were taught alongside lessons in loyalty, fealty, and the art of manipulation. Pages were trained to understand not only weapons and armor but also the complex hierarchy of feudal society. They learned to observe, to anticipate the needs of others, and to navigate the delicate dance of alliances and rivalries that defined medieval politics. In addition, religious instruction was intense. The church exerted enormous influence over the lives of knights, and boys were taught that obedience to God, King, and Lord was paramount. Sin in any form was to be feared, and moral failure could tarnish not only the individual's honor, but the standing of his entire family. Pages were expected to internalize these lessons while also performing exhausting daily labor, a dual burden that was physically taxing and mentally draining. As pages grew older, typically around the age of 14, they were promoted to squires. This transition was the true beginning of a boy's transformation into a knight, and it was brutal. Squires were apprentices in warfare, expected to learn how to handle weapons, care for horses, and survive in combat. The training regimen was punishing. Mornings were often spent with weapons drills, swinging swords, thrusting with lances, or practicing archery. Every strike, every maneuver, was intended not just to teach skill, but to harden the body. Bones were broken in practice, muscles torn, and bruises were common. Pain was normalized, it was understood as part of growth. Squires learned to fight while exhausted, hungry, and injured, a simulation of the horrors they would face in real battle. There were no protective measures like modern gyms or coaches. The goal was not comfort or well-being, but survival under extreme conditions. In addition to the physical training, squires were immersed in the social and political realities of knighthood. They accompanied their lords to tournaments, to courts, and sometimes even to war. They learned to serve, to anticipate needs, to act as shield bearers and assistants, but they also learned the darker sides of the profession. They witnessed brutality up close, soldiers being executed for minor infractions, rival nobles plotting assassination, peasants punished for crimes they did not commit. These lessons were as much about observation as action, teaching the squire that power was maintained through fear, loyalty was conditional, and violence was inevitable. By the time a boy reached the age where knighthood could be conferred, usually around 21, he had already endured more hardship than many adults would face in a lifetime. The training of a squire was not merely a preparation for war, it was also a test of character, endurance, and obedience. Squires were pushed to their physical limits, but also to their emotional and psychological limits. They were expected to endure humiliation with stoicism, to respond to insults with honor, and to manage fear without faltering. The mental toll was enormous. Being constantly tested, beaten, and scrutinized left many young men anxious, insecure, or socially stunted, yet these traits were seen as desirable in a knight. A perfect knight was not someone who was merely skilled with a sword, but someone who could endure hardship without complaint, someone who could remain composed under terror, and someone who would obey orders even when they conflicted with personal morality. The social structure surrounding a knight's upbringing compounded this pressure. Every action of a young knight reflected not only on himself, but on his family, his mentor, and his entire lineage. Noble families invested heavily in the success of their sons, viewing them as both assets and symbols. A knight's failure could ruin alliances, weaken political influence, and dishonor an entire household. This made the stakes of training extraordinarily high. Failure was not personal, it was public. Humiliation, injury, or death was always looming, and the consequences were always far-reaching. The environment created a culture of perfectionism, of constant self-monitoring, and of relentless competition among peers. Even the rewards promised to those who endured this harsh upbringing were not what popular imagination suggests. Knighthood was associated with honor, glory, and social prestige, but these were conditional and fleeting. Knights could rise in status, gain lands, and earn recognition, but only if they survived the training, fought successfully in battle, and navigated the complex web of feudal loyalties. Many never achieved these goals. Some were killed in combat before their first campaign. Others succumbed to disease, infection, or injury. The romanticized vision of knighthood did not account for the precariousness of life in medieval Europe. Survival itself was an achievement, and even then, a knight's youth had been marked by years of hardship, deprivation, and fear. The training process was also psychologically manipulative. Young boys were taught that suffering was virtuous, that pain built character, and that obedience was moral. But in reality, this served to maintain control. By instilling fear and dependence, mentors and lords ensured that future knights would internalize the social order and accept their role in perpetuating it. A boy was conditioned to believe that hardship was necessary, that pain was honorable, and that questioning authority was a sin. This conditioning created men who were capable fighters but often fragile human beings beneath the armor. Many struggled with anxiety, depression, or trauma from experiences that contemporary society would recognize as abusive. Yet in the context of the medieval world, these were considered rites of passage, essential for producing effective soldiers. The day-to-day life of a page or squire was far from glamorous. It involved cold, hunger, exhaustion, and constant labor. Pages woke before dawn and went to bed long after dark. They worked in kitchens, stables, armories, and training yards. They cleaned weapons, polished armor, and performed endless errands for their superiors. Squires were constantly tested in combat drills, wrestling exercises, and mock battles. Injuries were common, from minor bruises to broken limbs. Medical care was primitive, and infections could easily become fatal. Yet these risks were normalized. They were simply part of the journey to knighthood. Even within this harsh environment, competition among peers added another layer of difficulty. Squires were often compared to one another, ranked in skill, obedience, and appearance. Jealousy, rivalry, and sabotage were common. A boy who fell behind in training or made a public mistake could be ostracized or ridiculed. The psychological pressure was immense. From childhood into adolescence, young knights in training learned to suppress fear, conceal pain, and present a facade of unwavering strength. They were taught that vulnerability was weakness, and that weakness could be fatal in both literal and social terms. Finally, it is important to remember that this brutal upbringing was not optional. Noble families, lords, and even the church expected boys to endure it. There were no alternative paths for most. Failure to complete the training could result in social marginalization or worse. The young knight was trapped in a system that demanded obedience, endurance, and excellence at all costs. His childhood, his health, his happiness, and often his very life were subordinated to a role that was defined by others. When we imagine the life of a medieval knight, we often picture glory, adventure, and heroism. But in reality it began with a childhood that was harsh, unforgiving, and relentless. Pages and squires were subjected to a regimen of labor, training, discipline, and moral conditioning, designed to prepare them for a life of violence, hierarchy, and service. Pain, humiliation, injury, and fear were constants. The lessons they learned were not merely about skill with a sword or horsemanship. They were about survival, obedience, and the ruthless realities of a world where only the strong endured. By the time a boy was finally ready to be knighted, he had already spent over a decade enduring extreme physical and psychological hardships. His body was scarred, his mind trained to suppress fear, and his identity molded to serve others. The image of the noble, heroic knight that society celebrated was built on a foundation of suffering and sacrifice. Childhood had been stolen, innocence replaced by discipline, and play replaced by preparation for the horrors of battle and service. The reality of becoming a knight was harsh, unrelenting, and, by modern standards, almost unimaginable. In understanding this, we begin to grasp why being a medieval knight truly sucked. It was not the battles, the injuries, or the danger that alone made it difficult. It was the entire system that shaped a boy from the age of 7, stripping away the freedoms, comforts, and joys of childhood, in the relentless pursuit of an ideal that was as punishing as it was prestigious. The myth of chivalry, honor, and glory was imposed from above, but it came at the cost of real human suffering. To be a knight was to live under pressure, to endure pain, and to sacrifice one's youth for a role that demanded perfection, loyalty, and survival above all else. The childhood of a knight was not a story of heroic beginnings. It was a story of relentless struggle, shaping boys into soldiers who were often stronger than their bodies, yet never truly free from the chains of expectation and hardship that defined their lives. When we think of medieval knights, it is often the armor that captures our imagination first. Shining steel, intricate engravings, polished surfaces that reflect the sun, these images have been burned into our collective consciousness by centuries of art, literature, and cinema. Armor evokes power, invincibility, and prestige. It suggests that the knight beneath is untouchable, a near mythical warrior who can charge into battle without fear and emerge victorious, his glory untainted. But this vision, like so much of the mythology surrounding knighthood, is misleading. Behind the gleaming metal lay a reality that was harsh, unforgiving, and often life-threatening. Armor was not protection from suffering, it was a weighty prison, a constricting shell that transformed every action, every movement, and every breath into a struggle. The first fact to understand is that armor was heavy, very heavy. A full suit of plate armor, including helmet, breastplate, gauntlets, greaves, and boots, could weigh anywhere from 25 to 35 kilograms, depending on the period, the style, and the stature of the knight. That might not sound insurmountable until you realize that this weight was distributed unevenly and constantly pressed against the body in awkward ways. Standing for hours, walking long distances, or performing complex maneuvers became exhausting. Knights trained extensively to carry this weight, but even the most well-conditioned man would be drained after a few hours in full armor. The human body is not naturally designed to move fluidly under such constraints. Every step was deliberate. Every swing of a sword required extra effort. Every mount or dismount from a horse became a challenge that demanded both strength and balance. The armor was protection in one sense, yes, but it was also a constant physical burden, a weight that threatened to crush as much as shield. The process of putting on armor was itself a grueling ritual. Most knights could not do it alone. Servants or squires were required to help layer each piece, ensuring that straps were tightened, buckles secured, and gaps minimized. A suit of armor was a complex construction of overlapping plates, chainmail, and padding. It had to be fitted correctly, or it could impair movement, chafe the skin, or leave vital areas exposed. Hours were sometimes spent donning the armor, especially for ceremonial purposes or for extended campaigns. The act of wearing it required patience, endurance, and tolerance of discomfort. Even before reaching the battlefield, a knight's body was tested, confined, and strained. This was the first level of suffering that most people today overlook when they imagine knighthood. Once a knight was armored, he faced a new set of challenges. Heat, for instance, was relentless. Steel conducts and retains heat, and in the blazing sun of a European summer, the temperature inside a full suit could rise to dangerous levels. Dehydration was a constant threat. Sweat poured into the eyes, drenched padding, and caused chafing. Overheating could lead to exhaustion, fainting, or even death if a knight was not careful. The helmet, often enclosed with only a narrow slit for vision and ventilation, created its own problems. Breathing was laborious. Vision was limited. The simple act of turning the head required extra effort, and peripheral vision was nearly non-existent. In a world without modern hydration, sun protection, or medical care, a knight could be debilitated before ever engaging the enemy simply by enduring the heat inside his armor. Mobility, too, was dramatically restricted. Contrary to popular depictions, knights did not move effortlessly in full plate armor. Running was slow and cumbersome. Climbing or leaping was dangerous. Falling could result in catastrophic injury because the armor, while protective in some ways, also trapped the wearer in awkward positions. Kneeling, sitting, or mounting a horse became complicated tasks requiring careful technique. Many knights trained for years just to move effectively under these conditions, but fatigue could quickly turn a minor misstep into a serious accident. A misplaced step could strain muscles, sprain joints, or leave a knight vulnerable in battle. The psychological toll of armor was equally significant. Knights were constantly aware of their vulnerability despite appearances. They were enclosed in metal, yes, but the gaps in armor, under the arms, behind the knees, at the neck, inside gauntlets, were exposed to precise attacks. Archers, spearmen, and swordsmen could exploit these weaknesses, and a single well-aimed strike could be fatal. This knowledge created a persistent, underlying fear. Knights were trained to fight under these conditions, but anxiety and hyper-awareness were constant companions. The armor became both a shield and a cage, offering protection while amplifying awareness of fragility. Every step, every swing of a weapon, every charge across the battlefield was a negotiation with this constant, crushing weight. Combat while armored was a nightmare in ways that are difficult to imagine today. Battles were rarely organized spectacles with clean lines and clear rules. They were chaotic, loud, and deadly. Knights did not simply meet their enemies in formal duels. They were thrown into melees, surrounded by screaming men, collapsing horses, mud, blood, and confusion. Visibility was limited. Sound was distorted by helmets, padding, and the din of metal striking metal. Coordination was difficult. Amid this chaos, a knight had to maintain focus, wield weapons effectively, control a horse, and respond to threats from multiple directions. The sheer physical and cognitive strain was immense. Many knights were injured not by swords or arrows, but by falls, trampling, or collisions with other armored warriors. The battlefield was a dangerous labyrinth, and survival often depended more on endurance, awareness, and luck than on skill alone. Horses added another layer of complexity. Knights relied on their mounts for mobility and impact in battle, but horses could be unpredictable. Fighting while armored, mounted on a large, powerful animal, increased the difficulty of maneuvering. Horses were targets themselves. Arrows, spears, and swords could wound or kill them, throwing the knight to the ground. Once on the ground, the armor that protected him could now trap him. A knight fell awkwardly, and the heavy metal pressed him into the mud, entangling limbs and rendering movement almost impossible. Being trampled by horses, enemy or allied, was a common cause of death. The very tools designed to provide power, the horse and the armor, could easily become instruments of fatal vulnerability. Another often overlooked aspect was endurance over long campaigns. Knights were not only burdened during battle, they also had to march or ride long distances in full armor for days or weeks. Fatigue accumulated rapidly. Blisters, sores, and infections from constant chafing were inevitable. Rest was minimal, and the body deteriorated quickly under the strain. These were not occasional inconveniences, they were routine, unrelenting hardships. A knight's body was tested daily long before the first enemy was encountered. Armor also limited communication. In the noise of battle, in the isolation imposed by helmets, knights could barely hear commands, see signals, or coordinate with allies. Miscommunication could be deadly. Being cut off from allies even for a few moments could result in fatal vulnerability. Every knight was effectively isolated, left to rely on training, instinct, and personal endurance to survive. This isolation, combined with exhaustion and pain, created a mental environment that was as punishing as the physical one. The design of armor evolved over time to maximize protection, but it could never make a knight invincible. Plate armor was extremely effective against certain weapons, but it had weaknesses. Arrows could pierce joints, polearms could find gaps, heavy swords or maces could deliver blunt force trauma, breaking bones beneath the plates. Chainmail, while flexible, offered minimal protection against concussive blows. The armor created a false sense of security. It was protective, but it did not eliminate risk, and in some ways it increased it by making the wearer heavier, less agile, and more exhausted. Every engagement on the battlefield was a high-stakes negotiation between the armor, the weapon, the environment, and the human body trapped inside. In addition to the direct dangers of combat, knights faced environmental hazards. Rain turned battlefields into mud pits, making movement difficult and increasing the weight of the armor. Cold weather led to hypothermia, as metal conduct's cold and padded underlayers could only do so much. Sun exposure could cause dehydration and heat stroke. Knights were often away from food and water for long periods, and the physical exertion of fighting while armored exacerbated every deprivation. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, and pain compounded one another, creating conditions where even a skilled warrior could falter. Psychologically, armor also imposed a sense of claustrophobia. Knights were trapped in layers of metal and padding, unable to see or move freely. Helmets with narrow eye slits reduced peripheral vision, muffled sound, and created a sensation of confinement. In battle, this could cause panic, disorientation, and even vertigo. Knights had to train themselves not only to fight effectively but to manage the constant oppressive pressure of their environment. Many suffered exhaustion or fainted, not from enemy attack, but from the sheer weight, heat, and sensory deprivation imposed by their armor. Armor also influenced tactics in battle. Knights could not fight endlessly. Charges had to be carefully timed. Movements had to be calculated to conserve energy. The weight of the suit dictated the duration and intensity of engagement. Fatigue often determined the outcome more than skill or courage. A knight who had trained for years, but who mismanaged his energy or underestimated environmental conditions, could fall as easily as an untrained foot soldier. The romantic notion of the invincible, tireless knight is a product of imagination, not reality. Finally, it is essential to understand that the armor that caused so much suffering was also expensive. Knights often went into debt or impoverishment simply to acquire the best protection. Poorly made or ill-fitted armor could be as dangerous as no armor at all. Maintenance was constant. Rust, wear, and damage had to be repaired, often at significant cost. Knights had to rely on squires and servants to assist with upkeep, adding to the logistical burden. Armor, then, was both a shield and a chain, offering protection while imposing constraints, risks, and continuous labor. In truth, the armor that has become synonymous with the medieval knight's prestige was a source of suffering from dawn to dusk. It restricted movement, caused fatigue, induced pain, heightened risk, and imposed psychological strain. It protected the knight in some ways, but it also transformed every action into a negotiation with exhaustion, weight, and vulnerability. It was a constant reminder that the life of a knight was one of endurance, not freedom, one of confinement, not glory. Every swing of a sword, every mount of a horse, every step across the battlefield was burdened by the physical and mental weight of the armor itself. The knight was a warrior, yes, but he was also trapped inside a metallic coffin, forced to perform feats of extraordinary endurance under conditions that modern humans would barely tolerate for a minute. To imagine a knight in shining armor is to imagine power. To understand a knight in real armor is to witness struggle, suffering, and resilience. The armor that inspired awe from spectators and chroniclers alike was also a cage, a weight, and a constant challenge. Life inside it was exhausting, painful, and dangerous, not just in battle but in every movement, every action, and every moment spent carrying the burden of both metal and expectation. The myth of the invincible, heroic knight is shattered when we see the human reality behind the steel. Knights were strong, yes, but their strength was earned through endurance, suffering, and relentless conditioning. Their victories were hard-won not just against enemies, but against the weight, heat, and restriction of the armor they were forced to carry. The battlefield was not a stage for heroism alone. It was a theater of pain, exhaustion, and constant vulnerability. Behind the gleaming metal was a body pushed to its limits, a mind strained by sensory deprivation, and a spirit constantly aware of mortality. Shining armor may have captured the imagination of poets and painters, but it hid the brutal reality. Being a knight was not about invincibility, it was about survival. It was about managing exhaustion, pain, fear, and vulnerability while performing the impossible. And in this sense, the armor was both a blessing and a curse, offering protection while magnifying every hardship. It was the ultimate paradox of knighthood. The more it shielded the body, the more it confined the human spirit. The reality of being trapped inside armor, weighed down and constrained, is a powerful reminder that the life of a medieval knight was far from the romantic image we inherit. Every shine, every polish, every carefully engraved plate concealed not only vulnerability, but the relentless struggle required just to survive in a world that demanded constant performance under the heaviest burdens imaginable. To be a knight was to live in a world of physical limitation, psychological pressure, and existential danger, and to endure it with little room for error, hesitation, or rest. War in the Middle Ages was not what most people imagine today. There were no clean, cinematic duels, no noble standoffs with honor intact, no carefully choreographed charges punctuated by valiant speeches. Those are images constructed long after the fact, built by poets, storytellers, and later filmmakers to glorify the lives of men whose real experiences were far darker. In truth, medieval warfare was chaotic, terrifying, and merciless, a brutal dance of survival in which the strongest often died, the smartest often bled, and the bravest often had no hope of glory. For knights, who were trained and armored yet far from invincible, the battlefield was both a theater of their skill and a trap that could kill them in countless unpredictable ways. The first challenge of medieval combat was sensory overload. Unlike modern depictions, battles were rarely orderly or predictable. They erupted in fields, forests, or narrow passes where visibility was limited and terrain could change every few feet. The noise was deafening. Horses screamed, men shouted, swords clashed, arrows whistled through the air, and the groans of the wounded punctuated the chaos. Helmets muffled sounds, but they also distorted them. A knight had to distinguish friend from foe, anticipate attacks, and respond in real time, all while processing the physical exhaustion of wearing heavy armor, gripping weapons, and controlling a horse under immense strain. Even a well-trained knight could be disoriented within moments. Panic, confusion, and fear were as dangerous as enemy swords. In that environment, survival often depended on instinct, luck, and quick thinking as much as skill or courage. Fear was constant. Knights knew that death could come in an instant, often in ways that were sudden and horrific. A spear thrust at the wrong angle could pierce a weak point in armor, striking a vital organ. A mace or war hammer, designed to crush, could break bones beneath steel plates without any visible wound. Horses, essential for mobility and shock impact, could be wounded or killed, throwing their rider to the ground. On the ground, the knight became highly vulnerable, trapped in armor, struggling to rise, surrounded by enemies, and often facing trampling from both horses and foot soldiers. Fear was not simply a mental state. It was a tangible physical force that affected coordination, decision-making, and endurance. To deny it was impossible. To act despite it was the true measure of skill and training. The battlefield itself was a deadly labyrinth. Formations were constantly shifting, and lines could collapse without warning. Cavalry charges, once thought glamorous, often ended in chaos. Horses collided, riders were thrown, and units became entangled. Foot soldiers, armed with pikes, axes, and improvised weapons, swarmed knights who were vulnerable on the ground or bogged down in mud. Even a knight at the height of training could be surrounded and overwhelmed within seconds. There was no escape from the human tide pressing in, no time to strategize like in a modern battlefield simulation. Survival required constant awareness, stamina, and a level of brutality that most modern people would find unimaginable. Wounds on the battlefield were rarely survivable in any meaningful sense. Even minor injuries could become fatal due to infection, which was rampant. Blood loss, exposure, and contaminated water made recovery uncertain. Medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. A sword cut might be cleaned with alcohol or boiling water, but antiseptics, anesthesia, or antibiotics did not exist. Knights knew that a seemingly small wound could lead to a slow, agonizing death, and the psychological stress of this awareness weighed heavily during combat. The trauma of seeing comrades fall, often in gruesome ways, compounded the fear. Knights were expected to remain composed, but the human mind is not naturally wired to function amidst continuous bloodshed and horror. Knights also faced dangers from their own equipment. Weapons were unwieldy and heavy, and mistakes were common. A misdirected swing could injure the wielder or a nearby ally. Lances could shatter, spears could rebound, and swords could break. Armor, while protective, could trap a knight in fatal positions if he fell. This duality, where their tools of survival could easily become instruments of death, added another layer of psychological strain. Knights had to remain vigilant, skilled, and adaptive in a context where every element could turn against them. The unpredictability of medieval warfare was amplified by environmental conditions. Battles often took place in rain, mud, snow, or uneven terrain. Heavy rainfall could turn fields into quagmires, immobilizing horses and rendering armor unbearably heavy. Mud could hide pits, ditches, or bodies, creating lethal obstacles for both mounted and foot soldiers. Cold weather could numb fingers, reduce grip strength, and lead to hypothermia. Heat, as previously discussed in the context of armor, could cause exhaustion and collapse. Knights had to fight not only the enemy but also the natural environment, which often imposed as many risks as the opposing army. Every factor was amplified by the weight of armor, the stress of battle, and the ever-present threat of death. Combat was rarely one-on-one. Knights were often outnumbered, surrounded by foot soldiers armed with axes, pikes, and bows. Archers could fire volleys of arrows into formations, exploiting the gaps in armor. Polearms and spears could reach over shields and strike with lethal precision. The knight, trained in swordplay, lance, and horsemanship, found that his skills were constantly tested by the numbers, the chaos, and the terrain. Even the most skilled combatant could be overwhelmed if circumstances turned against him. Tactics mattered, yes, but in many instances, sheer randomness dictated who survived and who perished. The fear of capture added yet another layer of horror. Knights knew that surrender or being taken prisoner did not guarantee survival. Captured knights were often subjected to harsh treatment, ransom negotiations, or torture. If a family or lord could not pay the demanded ransom, imprisonment could stretch for months or years, often in deplorable conditions. Dungeons were dark, damp, and infested with vermin. Disease spread quickly, food was scarce, and the mental strain was extreme. Even avoiding death in combat offered no guarantee of safety or comfort afterward. The battlefield extended into imprisonment, and survival required negotiation, luck, or immense wealth to secure freedom. Battles were also psychologically exhausting. Knights had to maintain focus under extreme duress, often for hours. They had to make split-second decisions about when to attack, defend, retreat, or assist comrades. The need to balance self-preservation with duty, loyalty, and personal honor created a constant mental tension. A moment of hesitation could be fatal, while reckless bravery could be equally deadly. The cognitive load on a knight's mind was enormous. Exhaustion was inevitable both physically and mentally, and yet failure to maintain vigilance could mean immediate death. This pressure, combined with the sensory assault of noise, chaos, and fear, created conditions that would be recognized today as extreme trauma. Even outside the heat of direct combat, the anticipation of battle imposed its own horrors. Knights often marched for days to reach the battlefield, carrying heavy armor and weapons, subsisting on limited rations, and sleeping on hard ground or in poorly constructed camps. Sleep deprivation, hunger, and stress compounded fatigue. Anxiety about the coming battle could disrupt sleep, reduce morale, and weaken the body's ability to function effectively under the strain of combat. Knights were living under constant stress for days, weeks, or even months before the first clash of steel. The social dynamics of the battlefield also added tension. Knights were expected to maintain honor, follow orders, and uphold chivalric ideals even as survival instincts screamed otherwise. Loyalty to their lord, protection of allies, and adherence to rank created moral obligations that could conflict with personal safety. Knights were often forced to act against instinct to maintain discipline or avoid disgrace. Disobedience could be punished, not by law as we know it, but by immediate violence or loss of social standing. Every action carried consequences beyond immediate survival, adding another layer of psychological weight to the physical dangers already present. Casualties on the battlefield were enormous. Death could come in countless ways: swords, spears, arrows, blunt instruments, trampling, burns, drowning, or even disease spread by the close quarters of combat. Witnessing the deaths of comrades, the screams of the wounded, and the mutilation of bodies was a daily reality. Knights had to suppress horror and grief, often focusing instead on the immediate need to fight or survive. This suppression of natural human emotion was necessary for effectiveness, but came at a psychological cost that modern observers would recognize as trauma. Many knights were scarred not just physically, but mentally, carrying the weight of battlefield experience for the rest of their lives. In addition, medieval warfare was not limited to single battles. Knights often engaged in campaigns that spanned weeks, months, or even years. Each skirmish, siege, or ambush presented new dangers. Long marches, harsh weather, and scarcity of supplies amplified suffering. Disease and infection spread quickly in armies, claiming more lives than combat in many cases. Knights had to endure these conditions with minimal support, maintaining discipline, vigilance, and fighting capability even as their bodies and minds deteriorated. The life of a knight on campaign was relentless, with no respite from the physical and psychological toll of continuous exposure to danger. Sieges in particular were nightmarish. Knights participating in prolonged sieges faced starvation, disease, and constant bombardment. Defending or attacking fortified positions involved exposure to projectiles, boiling liquids, fire, and collapsing structures. The strain of maintaining readiness under these conditions was extreme. Fatigue, injury, and stress accumulated over days, weeks, or even months. Victory was uncertain and failure often catastrophic. Knights had to function as both soldiers and laborers, engaging in construction, repair, and defense while under threat of attack. The monotony, physical strain, and danger created an environment as punishing as any battlefield clash. The culmination of all these factors, fear, chaos, exhaustion, injury, environmental hazards, and social expectation, reveals the true horror of medieval warfare. Knights were trained, armored, and skilled, but these advantages could only partially mitigate the overwhelming physical and psychological challenges they faced. Victory was never guaranteed, safety was rare, and death was omnipresent. The romanticized image of knights as heroic, invincible figures is a creation of imagination. The real experience was one of relentless strain, terror, and suffering. Knights who survived battle did not emerge unscathed. Wounds, both visible and invisible, left lasting consequences. Broken bones, scars, and amputations were common, as were chronic pain and disability. Psychological trauma persisted long after the fighting ended, manifesting in nightmares, anxiety, and emotional numbness. Even celebrated victories were bittersweet, marked by the memory of fallen comrades and the awareness of narrowly escaped death. Life after battle was a complex mixture of relief, guilt, exhaustion, and preparation for the next inevitable conflict. In this context, the idea of knighthood as a life of honor and glory is revealed as a myth. The reality of medieval warfare was brutal, chaotic, and horrifying. Knights were trained to fight, yes, but survival was never assured. Every battle involved extreme physical exertion, exposure to deadly hazards, fear, and psychological stress. Armor, skill, and courage provided partial protection, but the human body and mind were constantly pushed to their limits. The battlefield was not a stage for heroism. It was a crucible of endurance, suffering, and survival. Understanding the horror of medieval warfare allows us to see the true cost of knighthood. Knights were not merely participants in conflict. They were human beings trapped in a system that demanded extraordinary physical and psychological resilience. They fought in conditions that would break most modern people within minutes. They endured fear, injury, and trauma not as exceptions but as daily realities. The battlefield was a place of relentless pressure in which courage alone was insufficient to guarantee survival. Each knight's story was a story of endurance, vulnerability, and the fragile balance between life and death. Medieval warfare also illuminates the broader reality of knighthood. Knights were not invincible heroes. They were humans trained to survive under extreme conditions, forced to endure suffering that modern audiences can scarcely imagine. Their skill, bravery, and armor could protect them to some degree, but they were never immune to the horrors surrounding them. The life of a knight was not measured in glory, but in the ability to withstand fear, fatigue, injury, and chaos. In the midst of battle, honor was secondary to survival, and courage was tested not by noble ideals, but by the relentless, horrifying reality of violence. Being a medieval knight was often portrayed as a life of wealth, power, and privilege. In paintings and stories, knights are shown astride magnificent horses, clad in polished armor, adorned with family crests, and attended by servants. The reality, however, was starkly different. For most knights, poverty was a constant companion, financial insecurity was a relentless pressure, and honor was often a fragile illusion rather than a guaranteed reward. The economic realities of knighthood could be as punishing as the battlefield itself, creating a life of constant stress, responsibility, and struggle. At the heart of this reality was the immense cost of maintaining the appearance and function of a knight. Armor, weapons, horses, and equipment were extraordinarily expensive. A full set of plate armor was not a simple investment. It was a substantial financial burden that could exceed the annual income of a minor noble. Maintaining weapons, shields, lances, and other accoutrements added to the costs. Horses, especially trained war horses, were expensive to acquire, feed, and care for. Every item needed regular maintenance. Armor had to be cleaned and polished to prevent rust. Weapons had to be sharpened, and horses required daily feeding, grooming, and stabling. The expense was not a one-time burden. It was continuous. Knights who could not meet these costs risked embarrassment, social marginalization, or even death in battle due to inadequate equipment. Many knights were not born into vast wealth but were minor nobles or the younger sons of more prominent families. They did not inherit large estates, and they had to navigate the financial pressures of their station while still upholding the appearance of knighthood. In such circumstances it was common for knights to incur debts to maintain their armor, horses, and lifestyle. Money was borrowed from merchants, richer lords, or moneylenders, often at high interest rates. A failed campaign, a lost tournament, or a poor harvest could render a knight insolvent, leaving him vulnerable both economically and socially. Poverty for a knight was not simply a matter of personal discomfort. It carried consequences for honor, reputation, and opportunity. Debt could compromise alliances, weaken a lord's confidence in him, and reduce his ability to participate effectively in war. In addition to financial hardship, knights faced the constant risk of capture. Wars in medieval Europe were not merely about victory on the battlefield. They were also about ransom. Knights were prime targets for capture precisely because they were wealthy, or at least perceived to be. Being taken prisoner did not guarantee safety. It created a new set of dangers. Captured knights were often held in castles, dungeons, or fortified keeps, where conditions were harsh and survival uncertain. Food was limited, water was scarce or contaminated, and hygiene was virtually non-existent. Disease spread quickly in the confined quarters, claiming more lives than weapons in many cases. Exposure to damp, cold, and filth weakened the body, often leaving the knight vulnerable to infection or illness. Prisoners might survive the initial capture only to die months later from conditions that would now be considered treatable. The ransom system, central to medieval warfare, was both a lifeline and a trap. If a knight's family or lord could pay, he might be released, sometimes only after months or years. The process was humiliating, stressful, and expensive. Wealthy captives could be held for years as negotiators haggled over sums that were frequently enormous. If a ransom could not be raised, the knight might languish indefinitely in a cell, suffering from neglect, malnutrition, and psychological torment. In some cases, failure to secure a ransom meant execution, often public and brutal, reinforcing the precariousness of life for even the most skilled and armored warriors. The fear of capture, and the constant awareness that it could happen at any moment, created a pervasive psychological strain that accompanied knights both on and off the battlefield. Even when free from capture, knights faced challenges in maintaining their social and economic position. Honor, a central pillar of the knightly ideal, was a fragile and often elusive concept. Knights were expected to uphold their personal and family reputation through acts of valor, loyalty, and adherence to the chivalric code. Yet, honor was not a guarantee of security or wealth. It was socially constructed and maintained by perception, rumor, and politics. A knight could perform bravely, but if circumstances or gossip undermined his reputation, his honor could be compromised. Loss of honor had real consequences: reduced marriage prospects, diminished influence in court, or exclusion from military campaigns. The weight of expectation was immense. Every decision, every failure, every perceived slight could erode what little security he had in a world where survival was never certain. The social environment of knighthood added another layer of complexity. Knights were often enmeshed in the intricate web of feudal obligations, where loyalty to a lord could conflict with personal ambition or survival. Obligations were strict and unforgiving. A knight owed military service, advice, and personal support to his lord. Refusal to comply could result in disgrace, loss of property, or even execution. Yet fulfilling these obligations carried risks. Sending troops to battle could result in heavy casualties. Joining a campaign could leave estates vulnerable to attack. Knights constantly had to balance duty, personal interest, and survival, often with incomplete information and under extreme pressure. The tension between loyalty and self-preservation created moral and strategic dilemmas that could haunt a knight for a lifetime. Many knights attempted to supplement their income through tournaments or mercenary service, but these ventures were risky. Tournaments were physically dangerous, and success required both skill and luck. Injury or defeat could leave a knight indebted, humiliated, or permanently disabled. Mercenary work provided income, but it also exposed knights to new dangers, including unfamiliar terrain, hostile populations, and unpredictable allies. Campaigning for pay rather than honor was sometimes necessary for survival, but it carried the social stigma of serving for money rather than principle. Knights were trapped in a cycle where economic necessity often conflicted with ideals of honor, loyalty, and social expectation. Survival required pragmatism, but the cultural narrative demanded valor, loyalty, and heroism. Reconciling these contradictions was a constant source of stress and struggle. Family expectations intensified these pressures. Knights were not only responsible for themselves, but also for the legacy of their lineage. Maintaining estates, managing finances, and ensuring family honor required skill and diligence beyond the battlefield. A mismanaged estate, a failed campaign, or poor financial planning could tarnish the family's reputation for generations. Younger sons, in particular, were often pressed into knighthood with limited resources, forced to navigate these complex economic and social pressures while simultaneously proving themselves in combat. The combination of personal risk, financial strain, and familial expectation created a life in which stress and anxiety were constant companions. Marriage and alliances added another layer of challenge. Knights were expected to marry strategically to secure wealth, land, and political influence. Yet many could not afford dowries, or they found themselves at odds with their own ambitions. Marriages could be arranged, forced, or politically motivated, leaving little room for personal choice or happiness. The pressures of sustaining honor, wealth, and social standing could make personal life a source of stress and constraint. Failure to marry advantageously could result in economic hardship or diminished social influence, reinforcing the idea that a knight's life was never fully his own. Even acts of heroism could be dangerous. Success in battle often brought expectations of repayment, fealty, or further service. Victory could lead to new obligations, additional military campaigns, or expanded financial burdens. Knights who distinguished themselves could be rewarded, yes, but these rewards were conditional, often delayed, and sometimes hollow. Failure, or even perceived failure, could lead to social humiliation, debt, or worse. The life of a knight was a constant negotiation between duty, personal survival, and social expectation, a precarious balance that required skill, endurance, and resilience. Psychologically, the pressure of poverty and captivity was immense. Knights were trained to be stoic, brave, and obedient, but the reality of financial insecurity, the threat of capture, and the fragility of honor created ongoing stress. Anxiety, fear, and despair were as much a part of their lives as swords and armor. Many knights suffered quietly, bearing the weight of debt, captivity, and social expectation while continuing to perform the outward behaviors demanded of their station. Mental strain, like physical injury, was often invisible to the outside world, yet it shaped every decision, every battle, and every interaction. The long-term consequences of poverty, capture, and broken honor severe. Knights who survived campaigns and battles often returned home exhausted, wounded, and burdened by debt. Some were physically crippled, others psychologically scarred. Many found that their estates were mismanaged in their absence, families had suffered, or social positions had eroded. Even those who had survived with honor intact faced ongoing challenges of maintaining their wealth, property, and reputation. Life as a knight offered no guarantees. It was a constant test of skill, endurance, and adaptability, both on and off the battlefield. In addition, the interplay of warfare, poverty, and social expectation meant that knights were often forced to make morally complex decisions. Loyalty to a lord could conflict with personal safety. Financial necessity could demand acts of mercenary service or political compromise. Maintaining honor could require risking life unnecessarily. These dilemmas were not theoretical. They were lived realities that defined the knightly existence. Every choice carried consequences, and the margin for error was small. The knight's life was not one of carefree heroism, but of constant calculation, endurance, and negotiation with circumstances often beyond his control. Ultimately, the combination of poverty, capture, and fragile honor reveals the true cost of knighthood beyond the battlefield. While society celebrated knights as noble, courageous, and invincible, the reality was one of vulnerability, economic strain, and social precariousness. Armor and weapons could protect the body. Skill could provide advantage, and bravery could inspire. But these factors did not shield a knight from the financial, social, or psychological challenges of his station. Poverty could cripple a man as effectively as a sword. Capture could strip him of freedom and dignity. Honor could be broken by forces beyond his control. Survival required constant adaptation, resilience, and endurance. The life of a knight was never easy. It was fraught with hardship, uncertainty, and risk at every turn. Understanding this aspect of knighthood allows us to see the human reality behind the myth. Knights were not merely warriors, they were economic actors, social participants, and moral beings navigating an unforgiving world. Their armor protected them physically, but did nothing to shield them from debt, capture, or social judgment. Their skill and courage mitigated some dangers, but could not guarantee success or safety. The romanticized vision of knighthood obscures these truths, presenting an image of invulnerability and honor that few actually experienced. In reality, the knight's life was a delicate balance between survival, reputation, and obligation, a balance that could be disrupted by chance, misfortune, or human cruelty. The experiences of poverty, capture, and broken honor remind us that knighthood was not a static or guaranteed privilege. It was a role that demanded constant effort, resilience, and adaptation. Wealth and status were fragile, physical safety was never assured, and social standing could be lost in an instant. Knights navigated these challenges daily, bearing both the visible burdens of armor and weapons, and the invisible burdens of fear, stress, and obligation. To survive as a knight required more than skill with a sword. It required endurance, cunning, and an unyielding capacity to persevere in a world that was often indifferent to their struggles. The life of a medieval knight did not end with victory in battle or triumph in tournaments. In fact, for many knights, the final chapters of their lives were marked not by glory but by exhaustion, obscurity, and a profound sense of futility. The myths of chivalry, honor, and eternal fame gloss over the harsh reality. Few knights died remembered, celebrated, or revered. Most ended their days far from the imagined grandeur of shining armor and heroic deeds, grappling instead with the weight of their failures, the decay of their bodies, and the slow erosion of the life they had fought so hard to sustain. Even for those who survived decades of combat and service, age was a relentless adversary. The very skills that had ensured survival on the battlefield, strength, agility, endurance, declined steadily. Muscles weakened, reflexes slowed, and injuries sustained over a lifetime took their toll. Knights bore the cumulative scars of years spent under armor, in mud, in rain, and in battle. Broken bones that had never fully healed, chronic joint pain, infections, and untreated injuries lingered, making simple tasks arduous. A knight who had once charged fearlessly on horseback, swinging a lance with lethal precision, might find himself unable to mount his horse, lift his sword, or even walk without pain. The passage of time, merciless and impartial, rendered obsolete the very tools and abilities that had defined his identity for decades. Economic decline often accompanied physical deterioration. Maintaining armor, weapons, and horses was an ongoing expense that could be burdensome even for well-resourced knights. For those who had spent years fighting, traveling, or serving lords who had since died or fallen from power, resources were often depleted. Estates could be mismanaged in their absence, lands could be seized, sold, or divided among heirs. Knights who had once commanded respect and authority found themselves struggling to maintain a basic standard of living. Poverty, debt, and insecurity were as common at the end of a knight's life as they were at the beginning. The perception of social status often relied on outward appearances and possessions, and when those diminished, the knight's relevance and influence often faded along with them. Even more devastating was the loss of purpose. The knightly identity was inseparable from the idea of service, honor, and martial prowess. When a knight could no longer fight, when age or injury rendered him ineffective, he faced not only physical limitations, but a profound existential crisis. He was trained from childhood to serve, protect, and demonstrate valor. Without the opportunity to engage in these activities, he often felt useless. Many turned to positions as administrators, advisors, or ceremonial figures in the households of younger lords. But these roles were pale shadows of the life they had imagined. The shift from action to observation was psychologically difficult. A knight who had once been at the center of campaigns, who had faced life and death decisions with courage, could find himself sidelined, witnessing the rise of younger, more capable warriors. Pride, ambition, and identity were challenged, sometimes irreparably. Illness was another persistent threat. Medieval medicine was rudimentary, and conditions that are treatable today were often fatal. Knights, accustomed to ignoring pain and continuing despite injuries, frequently suffered silently. Chronic conditions, untreated infections, and the long-term effects of battlefield wounds often culminated in a slow decline. Diseases such as gout, arthritis, and respiratory infections were common among aging knights, exacerbated by the harsh conditions endured throughout their lives. Many knights died not in battle but from these illnesses, lingering in pain and weakness, their final days far removed from the romanticized heroism often depicted in literature. Psychological strain often persisted as well. The trauma of years of combat, the fear of death, and the weight of responsibility could leave lingering emotional scars. Survivors who had seen countless comrades fall, villages burned, and innocents slaughtered carried memories that haunted them. Nightmares, anxiety, and depression were common, though rarely recognized or treated in medieval society. The mental toll of a lifetime spent in the service of others, facing constant danger and enduring relentless hardship was profound. Even the most celebrated knights could end their lives haunted by past decisions, failures, or losses. For many, the end of life was a long reckoning with the cost of survival, far from any triumphant narrative of honor or glory. Social isolation compounded these hardships. As knights aged or lost influence, they could find themselves marginalized, their counsel and experience overlooked. Younger nobles often replaced them, and political alliances shifted. Friends and comrades died in battle or from illness, leaving the aging knight without a support network. Widows and children might have their own obligations, leaving little time for companionship. Loneliness became a significant aspect of the latter part of a knight's life, a stark contrast to the camaraderie, hierarchy, and structure that had defined his earlier years. The end of a knight's life was often not marked by celebration or ceremony, but by quiet obscurity, overshadowed by the younger, more vibrant members of society. Many knights faced the indignity of financial mismanagement or loss of property late in life. Estates could be seized, sold, or misappropriated. Wars and political turmoil often resulted in the redistribution of lands, leaving veterans without the security they had once relied upon. A knight who had dedicated his life to service might find himself impoverished, forced to sell possessions, or reliant on the charity of others. The social stigma of lost wealth compounded the psychological burden, undermining the very identity that had been constructed through years of training, service, and martial success. Wealth and property were not merely practical concerns. They were intertwined with honor, status, and legacy. Their loss was therefore deeply felt, marking a profound shift in a knight's standing within the world he had fought to navigate. The ultimate end of a knight was often unremarkable. Unlike kings or legendary heroes, most knights died in relative obscurity, their names fading from records and memory. Their deeds, no matter how courageous or skilled, were often overshadowed by the politics, warfare, and dynastic ambitions of their lords. A life spent in service, honor, and combat could conclude quietly, far from the banners, trumpets, and chroniclers that immortalized others. The romantic image of a knight dying gloriously in battle was, for the vast majority, a rarity. More commonly, a knight's final moments were spent in infirmity, reflection, or isolation, confronting the decay of body, spirit, and relevance. Legacy, too, was fragile. Medieval society emphasized lineage, heirs, and material inheritance as measures of a knight's impact. Without heirs or wealth to pass on, a knight's contributions could vanish into history. Castles crumbled, lands were absorbed by other families, and the memory of valor faded. Stories of heroism might persist for a generation or two, but without chroniclers, patrons, or descendants to preserve them, most knights were forgotten. This impermanence was a harsh reality, especially for men who had dedicated decades to achieving honor, status, and recognition. Their lives, filled with struggle, endurance, and sacrifice, often left little more than a faint imprint on history. Religion played a complex role in the end of a knight's life. Many knights turned to the church, seeking solace, forgiveness, or spiritual purpose. Pilgrimages, donations, or monastic retirement were options for those who could afford them. Yet even this was fraught with challenges. Spiritual institutions could demand tribute, obedience, or service. The promise of salvation did not erase the pain, exhaustion, or regret accumulated over decades. Some knights sought comfort in faith, others in contemplation, but the harsh realities of their lives, poverty, injury, psychological scars, remained present until the very end. Religion offered structure and hope, but it could not undo the lifetime of hardship that had defined their existence. Violence could still reach knights even in their old age. Feuds, political disputes, and local conflicts meant that retired knights were not guaranteed peace. Many were called upon to settle disputes, defend territory, or advise younger warriors, sometimes putting themselves at risk long after their prime. A lifetime of service did not protect them from the dangers of the world they had fought to navigate. Aging knights were aware that threats persisted, that violence could intrude unexpectedly, and that death could arrive at any moment, often unceremoniously. The final chapters of a knight's life were rarely serene. They were often punctuated by reminders that the world remained unforgiving, regardless of past deeds. The psychological burden of reflection also weighed heavily. Many knights spent their final years contemplating choices, failures, and missed opportunities. Wars fought for lords whose favor had shifted, battles won at great personal cost, and years of hardship endured in service often led to regret or bitterness. Even accomplishments could be sources of sorrow, reminding knights of the friends, comrades, and innocence lost along the way. Memory itself became a double-edged sword, preserving both pride and pain. The end of life was a confrontation not only with mortality, but with the totality of experience, a reckoning with suffering, duty, and the impermanence of human endeavor. Knights who survived the long arc of their lives often became witnesses to a changing world. Younger generations, new technologies, shifting political landscapes, and evolving warfare meant that the methods, skills, and ideals of one era became obsolete. Knights who had trained and fought according to the codes of their youth could find themselves marginalized, replaced, or ignored. The world moved forward while they remained anchored in memory and tradition. Adaptation was necessary but difficult, as decades of conditioning, identity formation, and expectation had instilled a rigid conception of honor, duty, and purpose. This disconnect between experience and contemporary relevance often contributed to a sense of irrelevance or failure, a final, subtle cruelty in the life of a knight. Death itself was seldom celebrated. Without wealth, heirs, or chroniclers to document their passing, many knights were buried in simple graves, unmarked or minimally marked, in small churchyards or family plots. The grandeur often imagined in literature, elaborate tombs, monuments, or ongoing remembrance, was reserved for the elite few. The majority faced an end that was quiet, unremarkable, and soon forgotten by the wider world. Yet, even in obscurity, the echoes of a lifetime of endurance, sacrifice, and hardship persisted in the lives of those they had influenced, the battles they had fought, and the communities they had protected or served. In understanding the forgotten end of a knight, we see the full arc of knighthood as a life defined by struggle, service, and impermanence. The battles, training, hardships, and social pressures all culminated in a final stage that was often quiet, lonely, and uncelebrated. Glory was fleeting, honor fragile, and survival never guaranteed. The myths of chivalric romance obscure this reality, presenting an image of heroism and immortality that few knights ever experienced. In truth, the life of a knight was a long negotiation with mortality, vulnerability, and the relentless passage of time. The end of knighthood was not merely a physical decline, but a reckoning with the impermanence of human effort. Every victory, every battle, every act of courage was ultimately temporary in the grand sweep of history. Knights who had endured decades of hardship often died unnoticed, their struggles and sacrifices fading into obscurity. The romantic ideals of eternal honor, lasting fame, and invincible glory were rarely realized. Instead, knights faced a harsh, human reality. The end of life was a return to the silence from which they had emerged, their stories preserved only in fragments, chronicles, or the faint memory of descendants. Yet within this reality, there was also a quiet resilience. Knights who survived decades of combat, hardship, and social expectation embodied a remarkable endurance. Even when forgotten by history, their lives testify to the capacity of human beings to endure pain, fear, and adversity. Their experiences offer insight not only into the brutality of medieval warfare and society, but also into the human capacity for perseverance. The Forgotten End of a Knight underscores the contrast between romantic myth and lived experience, revealing the true cost of service, loyalty, and survival in a world that rarely rewarded effort with recognition or comfort. To understand knighthood fully, one must confront this final truth: the end was often the harshest chapter of all. After decades of physical exertion, battlefield trauma, financial strain, and social responsibility, knights faced mortality largely alone, their deeds fading into memory, their suffering largely unrecorded. The life of a knight was not a linear path from glory to honor. It was a cycle of struggle, endurance, and often quiet disappearance. The human reality was unglamorous, fraught with hardship, and remarkably demanding, a stark contrast to the shining armor and celebrated heroism imagined by posterity. In the final analysis, The Forgotten End of a Knight completes the picture of why knighthood truly sucked. From childhood training and the relentless weight of armor to the horrors of battle, financial insecurity, captivity, and social pressure, the life of a knight was one of constant challenge. And even surviving all of this did not guarantee a dignified or celebrated end. Instead, many knights passed quietly, unnoticed, and unheralded, their sacrifices absorbed by the indifferent march of history. The shining myths of glory, honor, and eternal remembrance obscure the full human cost, the exhaustion, and the inevitable vulnerability that defined the reality of medieval knighthood. To be a knight was to endure, to serve, and ultimately to fade, a life of struggle that few outside of history's pages truly understand.